I'm going to go ahead and get started because, again, we only have 30 minutes. And I want to make sure there's enough time to get through everything. So for our agenda, I'm just going to briefly touch on like what it's like building LLM applications with Arize, some of the patterns we see, some of the tools that our customers find to be really helpful. I'll touch on our new releases, which are experiment visualizations, also give a little bit of insight on what experiments even are, how to use them, then embeddings for traces, and then I'm going to do a live demo of our experiment workflows, touch on embeddings as well. What's really cool about this is we're going to be using our actual data from our AI assistant Copilot to show off our real workflows. So you get an idea of what we do as AI engineers, as product managers, use our product to do. So let's get into it. So for anybody who's not aware of what Arize does, we're an AI observability and evaluation platform. So we allow you to trace, evaluate, and iterate on your applications. And we provide you all the tools and workflows to do that. So some of the common pains that we see with AI teams in development is there's no visibility into what's happening. There's a lot of calls that go into a lot of these applications. And so when you have no visibility, it's really difficult to know what is affecting the changes that or what changes are affecting your application. There's also no proactive protection against things like jailbreaks or PII leaks or even just bad performance. And it also can be very overwhelming to understand where you should focus for when you're trying to improve once your application is now live in production. And so with Arize, there's actually workflows and tools available to you to help you throughout your whole life cycle. So in early development, we have tools available like traces, even some of these other ones like evaluation, the prompt playground, data sets and experiments, all really helpful when you're actually developing your application and trying to get it to a level at which you can release it into production. Once in production, though, these last three steps are obviously really helpful. So there's tools like, guardrails, online evals. We have monitors and dashboards, as well as tools just to help you improve, like Copilot, like our embedding analyzer, similarity search, and annotations. So these are just some of the tools associated with some of the steps in the pipeline that we find them to be helpful at. But of course, it's not limited to these. I myself, as a developer for Copilot, find myself using all of these tools at various stages of our development and production life cycle. So cool. Now that we know a little bit about what Arize does, let's talk about some of our new releases. And I felt like we couldn't go into some of our new experiment visualizations without first touching on what an experiment is, in case anybody is not familiar with them. And so experiments are a method to test, validate, and changes to your LLM application. So we all know these systems can be very, very finicky. You change one thing, it has large impacts across the entire application. And so experiments are just give you this method that allow you to test anytime you make a change. So you can use these curated data sets and tasks to generate outputs, and then the evaluators are going to assess these outputs to measure improvements or troubleshoot issues. When we get to the demo portion, I'm actually going to walk you through all of these so you can understand how the different components work. But the purpose of these are really to help ensure your application is on track by measuring those changes. It's really important for improving iteration speed, allowing faster decision making, and understanding, the performance, latency, and cost trade-offs. So this visualization you see, this is one of our new releases. We now have this experiment over time kind of view here where you can look at your different experiments, understand how those metrics are changing as you iterate, as you run them. And it's super valuable, and you'll get to see that live in just a little bit. The other part of this is comparing experiments. So we also just released some visualizations that help you understand how your individual experiments are performing. And so you can track progress by monitoring improvements or regressions between changes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a little while. You can identify patterns, so you can recognize those trends and any reoccurring issues that you have in your outcomes. You can also analyze changes, so like pinpointing exactly where things aren't going the way that you would expect them to, or where you still need to improve. And then these are some of the benefits. So being able to measure that impact, being able to troubleshoot, actually having data-driven iteration. In the early days of doing the LM application development, it felt like a little bit we were developing in the dark, just kind of throwing something up and seeing how it worked and just kind of manually going through all these workflows to do that. Now with things like experiments, you can actually just make these informed decisions by comparing these results side by side and understanding exactly what the impact is that a given change has made. And this really does have an outcome of continuous insights into the impacts or changes to your model. So again, we'll get into all of this with the live demo, but just wanted to set a little scene of what experiments are. And so this is a area of the platform we're continuing to investigate or invest in. And so you'll see a lot of these product webinars, I'm sure, with future improvements to the experiment flows. The other thing that we're super excited about that we just released is embedding span visualization with UMAP. And so embeddings are super powerful tools for understanding the relationships between data points. If you don't have embeddings, a lot of times the insights that you unlock with them would otherwise remain hidden. You can imagine if you had all of these data rows, reading through all of that text can be really hard to manually do. But when you have this visualization, you're able to understand where those changes are happening or where there's a gap really easily by using this visualization. And so these are some of the use cases you can use embeddings, not all of them, just some. So things like your RAG use cases, being able to visualize the retrieved documents to spot gaps in your knowledge base, looking at your inputs and outputs to understand any patterns there, or maybe an emerging pattern. Maybe users are asking questions that in like maybe your agent tool stack you don't have a skill for. And you could really just use the UMAP and embedding inspection to drill into any type of embedding span that you want to identify those areas of misalignment or needs for improvement. So that's a little bit of the content part of it. I'm going to actually go through the demo now, stop sharing the slides, and talk you a little bit through what we use experiments for Copilot and show you some examples there of how we use it. And then, towards the end, I'll show you that embedding span visualization as well. So kind of going into the platform, we are our own users of Arize. So again, we have Arize Copilot. If you haven't seen it or played around with it, I definitely recommend it. It's your AI assistant to help you observe your AI. And so, just like any other person with an AI application, we are tracing it and we are using Arize to troubleshoot. And so Arize released Copilot back in July, and one of the tools that we first released was our AI search functionality, which allowed you to actually use semantic search to search a given column and get the results back. And when we first released that, it became an instant hit with our users. Everybody was using it. It was our most used skill. And so for me as, the product manager here, I decided that that was a skill that we should invest in. And so what we decided to do was build 4 additional skills for that router. And that would do things like, search across tables or do analysis or even just construct the query filter for you, something basic. But when I did that, I knew that there was going to be some changes that were needed. And one of the main changes, in addition to building the skills, was actually with our router. Before, the router only had 1 skill to call, now it had 4. And so I began combing through the data to understand what types of questions my users were getting. And I actually did that before I even decided which skills to build. And I started to see things like users wanting to construct that structured query. I saw users wanting to do analysis like counting or being able to look at traces where they're searching 2 columns at a time or all of the columns. So that's really what inspired us to build the skills that we did. And then in doing that, I actually created a data set that I can then use for an experiment. And so one thing that's really cool about our experiments, or I'm sorry, our data sets, is you can actually edit the spans. So, when these spans were all initially created, and we only had 1 skill available. So this output actually only had 1 function that the LLM could call. What's cool about data sets is I can actually edit. So I was able to edit all of these outputs to be the correct function in this new world with all of my new skills. So I had this great golden data set that I could then test this new router that I've created. So I'm going to hop into code for just a second. I'm not going to go into too much depth. I just want to show you a little bit about the process and how this works for us. So we have documentation on experiments if you want to dive into them a little bit more. But at the root, what this experiment does is it takes a data set. It then runs this data set through a task, and a task is going to basically be whatever component of your application you want to test. In my case, I was testing that this router here was going to actually call the right function using these new function guidelines. And so then once you have the task, we then have what's called an evaluator, which you're seeing here. In my case, I decided to have 2 evaluators. I have a function selection one, which means does it choose the right function? And then I also have an arguments one, which is, did it choose the right arguments for that function? These are LLM-based evaluators. You can choose to do like code-based evaluators. Say you had an LLM application that was supposed to spit out, a select number of values. You could use code to do that if you don't want to have, an LLM choose that for you. So there is some variety there, and you can have multiple evaluators, as I do here. You can have as many as you need. And so we're gonna basically take that data set, take those evaluators and that task, and we'll pass that into this experiment client here. And that data is going to then, go to Arize. So let me go back to the platform here and show you a little bit what that output looks like. So here you can see I've run 3 iterations of this experiment, and I'll tell you a little bit of the story behind each of them and even show you kind of the changes that I made between them. So this is that great visualization that I was showing you here. We can actually see over time how things are changing. It's great when you can want to, click into the given experiment, or if you want to drill into why one experiment is different than the other. You can also select from here. So if you were looking at this chart and you said, that's interesting, it definitely went up from 1 to 2. Let me look why. You can actually just select these 2 here and go ahead and compare. Before I do that, I'll give you a little bit of a background. Actually, you know what? We'll just jump right into it. So for experiment 1, this was the first router that I created after introducing the new functions. And so at the top here, this is another new release that we have, are these great visualizations that break down the percent of your metric. So for me, I'm seeing the percent of match versus mismatch and correct versus incorrect. And so that gives me a high level overview of like how well my router is doing. So, about 60% of my data set is getting the function correctly. Only, it's like less than 20% is getting the arguments right. So my first prompt that I created here, and I'll show you a little bit here, this just had a very basic function guidelines. I didn't really give that many examples here. I had a few, but nothing great. So what I decided to do after looking at these results here was create another iteration of these experiments using a new prompt router. And so this is me kind of still in, the development phase of these new skills. I'm not even quite putting them into production. So I created a new iteration of that router. And this time I added a little bit more detail to those function calling guidelines. You can see here they each have examples. I have some helpful hints that if a user query does this, call this function. I really beefed up the function calling guidelines. And so what's really cool is I can then add in that to my experiment. And now I can see, like, did that change that I make actually have the impact that I hoped it did? And you can see here, it did increase the number of correct function calling that I had. It did increase it to 75. You can still see here, though, that the arguments were not so much correct. And so we have this great table here, which allows you to actually start drilling into which of these rows are still causing the problem. So you can actually go ahead and expand these. You can add in your explanation. So I might want to add in my argument explanation to actually see what the column is that is causing the problem. So this one's a span evaluation column. And what's really interesting here is that I can see that in both of these cases, it's only calling span evaluations. It's actually not calling the specific eval that I'm looking for, the user's looking for in this query. So I wanted to try to adjust that a little bit. I can't have a function, calling the wrong arguments. It will then yield either an error or it's going to give a bad response. So I made a third iteration of my router template. And this time I tried to add some notes in around which columns might be what when the user is asking for them. So I told it that, questions are usually maybe synonymous with input and response is output. These are often eval labels, and that, if a user asks for an evaluation, that Copilot needed to look within span evaluations and grab that specific column, not just span evaluations. So I ran that experiment, and I'm going to go off and click off 1 and just compare 2 and 3 now. And what was interesting about this is this actually didn't have the impact it had. It actually caused a regression in Copilot's ability to call the right function. And you can see that here between 2 and 3, the correctness goes back down. And so this is another way that experiments are really helpful. I think, we like to assume that when we make a change to their prompts or to our LLMs that they're actually going to improve and not have any consequences, but that's usually not the case. So experiments are really helpful because they allow you to see both your improvements, but also where changes are having, consequences to them as well. And you can have a variety of experiments. You can see I use data sets in a lot of different ways for a Copilot. Here was another one I did for one of the new skills where I actually did an experiment just on the new skill text to filter that I built. And very similarly, you can see here again, I'm able to easily identify where the correct is, but also take a look at where, the function is incorrect, like this one here, where it seems like the column was unable, our Copilot was unable to identify where this attribute was in the schema. So experiments are just really helpful for testing and iterating. What's really cool is once I did these experiments once, specifically the AI search one that I showed you earlier, oops, is that once I kind of got to a good place with this testing criteria and we released the functions and we were happy with it, I actually was able to add this code as a CI/CD pipeline to Arize. And so basically I have this GitHub action where we're able to, and let me actually just pull it up in the test or in GitHub here, where we actually were able to go ahead and add this GitHub action so that anytime there's a push, or actually in production right now, it's actually on a PR on this folder path in our repo, this script here that you saw, a little bit of a different one, a productionalized version of it, is going to actually pull in the right prompt template, and then it's actually going to run. And so this is a GitHub action that runs when we push up a PR. And so what we've done is we've set actually a threshold that says, hey, if our function correctness score is not greater than 0.8, we're going to actually have this fail as a check. So now we've kind of built it into our development flow here. And, when that failure happens, I often come here to experiments, check it out, understand what the issues are. And so it just adds that automated testing to our AI development workflow. So we're kind of borrowing from software engineering there, bringing that here. And it just ensures that every time we make a change, we have the right guardrails in place, or guardrails is probably not the right word, right experiments in place to ensure that any changes we are making and we're going to push into production aren't impacting things and going to cause, bad responses to go to users or for any breaks in our pipeline. So experiments are really powerful. They're definitely one of my most used features in Arize. And so I know we have like about 12 minutes left. I am going to show embeddings, but I want to check to see if there's any questions. I see there's some. Let's see some in the QA chat. So yeah, if you have any questions either about this or when we get to embeddings or even now, feel free to drop them in the chat. But I have two here from Aziz in the chat here, so I'm going to answer them live. One question is, do embedding span visualizations come for free once you have traces populated? So how embedding spans actually work is you will create the embeddings outside of the platform. And so you can either do that for, your retrieval spans and get the embeddings for the retrieved documents, or you can embed your inputs and outputs. And so once you send those into the platform, creating, embedding spans is free. Having that visualization is free. There's no extra Arize license that you need. It's for anyone. You just have to create the embeddings on your side. And we will have some documentation and some tutorials out just in a little while for that. So yeah. Did you edit the span in the UI or code for experiments? Really great question. So I edited the prompt in my repo, in my PR that I was working on, but for my examples to update them so that I had the correct functions, because again, most of these examples were in my past world before I had all of these skills available, and I was using it to inform what new skills I should build. And so I actually did edit the outputs here in datasets. So when you're in datasets and you click into an example, there's this edit button up here. And that allows you to come in, you can edit any of these. For me, I only really cared about editing this output to make sure I had the right functions available. But in theory, you can edit any of these and these results will be saved to that data set. It does not impact the trace data. So this data here would be left alone if you make an edit on the experiment side of the house. Just check any other questions on experiments before I kind of move over to embeddings. Mhm. Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll drop the documentation for experiments embeddings, and there's also going to be a lot more content going into more depth of how we use experiments for Copilot. So definitely check it out and definitely try out experiments and data sets in the platform. These visualizations just make this tool even more powerful by surfacing up those insights with the visualizations. Cool. I'm gonna switch to another model. Copilot doesn't have embeddings yet. I'm actually working on that right now to our demo model here. So if you haven't raised an account and you go to our generative LM tracing, you can try this out today. It is available. And so just giving you a little context of what this application is, it's just a RAG application where we have user questions about Arize. So this one's asking, how do I use the SDK to upload a ranking model? And so you can see all the traces here, including that retrieval and embedding span. And so there's two ways that you can get to the embeddings view. You can go directly from a span. So if you're on a span and you actually want to go from here, you can go ahead and click view embedding. Or on this outer level here, we do have the embedding visualization. But for today, I'm just going to go ahead and go to the embedding span and show you this here. So you can view metrics over time. If you're interested, we're going to have more metrics available to you very soon. But what UMAP does is allows you to look at clusters of your points. So it's automatically going to cluster, like points together. And we're going to surface those clusters up to you. You can color by specific things like span property, data set. Cluster will also have metrics coming very soon. That just gives you a new dimension to go ahead and explore your data, understand like what inputs or what retrieve context is maybe missing. If we had, our retrieval or our knowledge base, I'm sorry, in here as well, you could compare that. You can select and look at specific points. So if there's a cluster that piques your interest, you can go ahead and select that. We'll show you all of the data here, like span ID and raw text. But what's also cool is you can actually click right into the span and do things like add to data set, which can be really helpful. Something that, a workflow that I think will be really powerful with this is being able to embed things like your inputs and understand where new user questions come in. Perhaps in my, AI search example, if I had the embeddings there and we had UMAP at that time, I would be able to see, those different searches coming in for AI search and understanding which of those were kind of outside of the regular ones and save that off to the data set that way versus, me kind of combing through the data. So goes back to that idea of, patterns with UMAP are a lot easier to see than when you're just kind of looking through that tabular data. So that's really the UMAP visualization. There's lots more to come to here, and we'll do many follow-up sessions with that, but want to pause here. I know we have about 6 minutes left and see if there are any questions. Seems a little quiet today. No worries about that. If anything comes up, feel free to reach out to us on our Slack community or ping me directly. There are two just announcements that I want to make and make sure everyone's aware. We do have our agent certification up now, so you can check that up at on our website. We just dropped the link there. We really packed in all of the knowledge we've learned from working on Copilot, from working with our users that have agent use cases, and really distilled it into this certification course. So definitely check that out if you're interested in agents. The other thing is we have a Vectera webinar 1 week from today. Definitely check that out. So it's going to be on agentic RAG. Going to be a really great webinar, so definitely check that out as well. Well, that's it from us today. Thank you all for joining, and we'll be back in a month with our next batch of releases. Thanks, y'all.